Well, thank you, Lisa Bloom, for coming on the show. Just to start things off, tell me a little bit about your career. You have represented a number of Epstein survivors in related to the Maxwell case that we've both been observing, right?
Yes, I was very proud to represent 8 victims of Jeffrey Epstein, and we fought their case for 2 years. We filed in the Southern District of New York, and then Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide in prison. So then we shifted to the Victim Compensation Fund, and we fought very hard to get certain provisions in that process, like the statute of limitations would not be a defense, which was very important to a number of our clients. And ultimately, we prevailed in 8 out of 8 of our cases there. And I've never been prouder of a group of clients. They went through so much. It was agony and so many mental health disorders as a result of being sexually abused by this man.
Mm. And I want to talk more about that later because that's something that has come up, the legacy of trauma again and again in the trial of Ghislaine Maxwell. So the government just wrapped up its case. We're about to start the defense's case this week. What were your overall impressions of how it went for prosecutors in building a case?
I thought the prosecutors did a very strong job. I thought all 4 of the accusers were very credible. You know, there's no perfect victim, there's no perfect plaintiff, and I do civil cases. And you take your victim as you find them. It's very common that there would be drug abuse or selling sex for money or inconsistent memories. All of that is very typical and normal and doesn't faze me. And I hope the jury will look at the case overall and not the way the defense wants them to, which is to pick apart every little thing to find any little inconsistency. And I'm optimistic that they will.
Mm. And in terms of what you were talking about, that there is no perfect victim, very often the things that are the legacy of abuse are the very things that can be attacked on defense. Isn't that right?
That's very well said. And that's exactly it. So, I represent 3 accusers of Paul Marciano and the company Guess, for example, right now. And I know from those cases, number one, how important it is that accusers be able to be Jane Does, to be anonymous if they choose to protect their privacy. That's a fight that we had in that case. And I know what PTSD is because virtually all of my clients in sexual harassment and sexual abuse cases have post-traumatic stress. It has a profound impact on someone's life. It's very limiting. It's very triggering. I've had clients go into mental hospitals, give up their careers. I mean, this is very significant stuff. And it underscores how damaging sexual abuse is. It is not a negative as the defense always tries to paint it.
And I realize there might be some limitation into how much depth you can go into this, but can you describe what it's like interacting with people who are experiencing trauma, how it affects those day-to-day interactions?
Well, yeah, and hardly anybody ever asks me that, so I'm glad that you did. I mean, I will tell you that in the last few weeks, I had a client who was suicidal, who was admitted to a mental hospital. I have clients who engage in a lot of self-harm. I have clients who very commonly have drug and alcohol problems. And sometimes they disappear and we're trying to reach them. There's a development in the case. We need to notify them. And, it might be days and days, a week or 2 even, and we can't get a hold of them. So we have to have emergency numbers for everybody and a person we can call, just like doctors, if clients disappear. Our clients are in a lot of anguish. It's very, very hard for them to even make that call to me, that first call, which is, of course, completely confidential. And many people call me and we never proceed with their case because they just decide they don't want to. But for even make that call is excruciating for them. And then every step of the case is so difficult. But I will also say there is a positive to this, and I don't want it to be all negative, because what I see is my clients get stronger as they go through the process. I say to them, you can do hard things, which people don't tell women enough. You can do hard things and you're doing it. We filed the case. You did your deposition. You've made it this far. Look at you. You can testify. And look at the 4 women in the Ghislaine Maxwell case. I'm sure they were terrified, but they came in, they held their head high, they answered the questions. And I suspect that when they walked out of the courtroom, they were a little stronger and able to face other things in their life with a little bit more courage.
And you were in the courtroom and observing several days of the proceedings, isn't that right?
Yeah, I was there for the entire first week. So I flew out to New York from Los Angeles, where I live, and I wanted to see the whole thing with my own two eyes. And I also had a lot of media outlets that wanted to interview me on behalf of the victims I represent. And I thought it was important that I see it with my own eyes if I'm going to be talking about it, because there's no cameras in the courtroom. And I certainly appreciate your work, Adam, and the work of all the journalists who are reporting what's going on, but I wanted to see it myself.
Thank you very much. And what were your conversations with your clients just based on what you saw?
You know, one of my clients just really didn't even want to talk about it. We resolved the case with the Epstein Victim Compensation Fund. She got her payment. She wants to move on. She does not even want to talk about it. Others say they are so glad that Ghislaine is being brought to justice. They never thought they would see this day. They still can't believe it. Every day that the trial goes on, they're still kind of in this shock phase of they just can't believe they're seeing this day. And of course, they hope that she's going to be convicted.
And so the defense case is about to begin this week. We've seen themes already, both in the cross-examination and in the opening statement. Maxwell's attorney, Bobby Sternheim, has hammered the themes of memory, manipulation, and money.
Yeah.
What's your reaction to the way the case is being framed by the defense?
Well, let's start with money, because that's the easiest one to knock down. So the four accusers who testified in the case, they all testified that they got money from the Victim Compensation Fund, just like my clients did. But here's the thing, it's already been paid. It's signed, sealed, delivered. It's already done. So they have no financial motive to come into this criminal trial. They don't get one additional dollar from testifying in the criminal trial. So that I don't think makes any sense. Manipulation, I guess the theory is that they're civil attorneys, people like me, somehow, manipulate them into saying certain things. I don't see any evidence of that from the cross-examination. I think it's frankly kind of offensive to the civil attorneys that they're arguing that. And then there's memory. And that one I think is going to be really their primary defense, because I know they're going to have Dr. Elizabeth Loftus testify, and she is a memory expert. I've been up against her in some of my cases years ago. She's never seen a sexual abuse victim who she thinks has a good memory and who's credible. So she's going to say that their memory is malleable and it's changed, and the inconsistencies show that they're liars, and probably bring up a lot of studies about memory being imperfect. And you know what? Memory is imperfect, but their memory does not have to be 100%. It just has to be the gravamen of what they're saying is true. And I think the jury will see that. Maybe around the edges, they got a date wrong, they got a detail wrong, but overall, they're telling the truth.
Isn't the kind of general nature of the defense in some sense an outgrowth of the history of the case, and in particular the fact that it's taken so long for us to get here, to get to a trial that, for example, with the money defense, well, there was nothing happening in terms of criminal justice, and civil action was the only way to get some sort of accountability from the victim's perspective. Same thing with memory. We're talking about a case where the allegations begin in 1994. Talk to me about the circuitous path of the case and how it's impacted both the prosecution and the defense.
Well, that's a very strong point. So when clients come to me, I always know I'm second best, that what we really want is a criminal conviction. That's what we wanted for Bill Cosby, for example. And I represented Janice Dickinson. We got a very substantial settlement award after a couple of years of litigating against him. But I also went with her to his criminal trial where she testified against him, because that was number one. That's what we really wanted. That's what we got. And then it was reversed later on in appeal, as everybody knows. I have many cases where I take clients to law enforcement and we beg law enforcement to act. And they don't. They almost never do. And I, frankly, at this point, I tell my clients, yeah, we should go to the police. I think we should report this. I think that's important. But I can almost guarantee you what's going to happen is they're going to very politely take your report, and then nothing is going to happen. And that's what I've seen over and over again. Now, Annie Farmer, one of the 4 victims in the Ghislaine Maxwell trial, as you know, testified that in 1996, she went to the police about Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, this honestly, right now, makes me choked up to even think about this. How many women's lives and psyches could have been spared if they would have acted on it in 1996? All of my 8 cases were after 1996. They were in the late 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s. I mean, it's just appalling that they didn't act. Shame on them. And so you're right. Now we have a case. Finally, in 2021, we have this case. Okay, good. At least, better late than never, I suppose. But then the defense can say, oh, well, memory, and so many years have passed and you can't believe the memory. Although, for Annie Farmer, it's also terrific that she has that diary from the time, and she has her mother and her boyfriend to back it up. And that's what you need in a case like this.
And also, of course, there was the 2008 plea deal that has generated a lot of controversy. And that you mentioned Annie Farmer's police report and her sister, Maria Farmer, in the mid 90s. There was also a delay after the plea deal had a huge influence over the case. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit?
Well, the plea deal in 2008, so for those who aren't up on it, it was basically a slap on the wrist, and Jeffrey Epstein was allowed to plead guilty to a prostitution charge, which a lot of my clients feel is really offensive because they are not prostitutes. And Jeffrey Epstein tricked them into sexual abuse and then gave them money afterwards. They feel very strongly they are not prostitutes, and they find that whole thing very offensive. And even more offensive is the fact that he was allowed to serve about a year, mostly from home, under very, very favorable conditions. And he got out and he went right back to his regular life. I mean, and there were a lot of victims at that time who were willing to testify. In fact, they brought a lawsuit later. I was not involved in that, but I followed it. They brought a lawsuit later claiming that they weren't consulted with in the way that the law required. Ultimately, I think they lost that case, but it's a shame because, these cases are hard. Victims are imperfect. I get it. But they could have tried. They could have done better. And instead, Jeffrey Epstein was allowed to go on as he did before.
And about just going into a kind of wrap up of how the prosecution kind of went through their case a lot quicker than people expected. This was expected to be a 6-week trial. We were done in 2 weeks. I know we've talked about some of this material before, some of this topic. What do you say to folks who were kind of surprised by how quickly this wrapped up?
So a trial is a very dynamic thing. And, we trial lawyers, we give estimates, and they're often wildly off. And that can be for a number of reasons. I don't know whether the prosecution perhaps had witnesses that either could not come or they decided they did not want them to come. I've been in trial where I had a whole plan, and you get through it and you think, oh, I think the case is good. I think we've put this in well. I think the jury gets it. I don't think we need to call 7 more witnesses. So I think in this case, I don't know what was going through their mind, but I think they put on a good, clean, solid case. I don't think they needed anything more. And we now have the defense that has a witness list with 35 witnesses on it, and they're going to call, I don't know how many of them. So that could take a few weeks. And then I know that the Christmas and New Year's weeks are short weeks in the courtroom. So we could end up, 4, 5, 6 weeks, closing arguments, jury, it could be something close to that. But I'll tell you something else, Adam. A lot of people I've heard people say, why aren't we hearing more about the other big names? Why aren't, right? And of course, that's not the focus of this trial. That's not the purpose of the trial. That's the purpose of maybe investigative journalism or a wonderful documentary that digs into these other big names. But this is a trial against Ghislaine Maxwell. And I think the prosecution has stayed focused on her. And I think they've put in a case.
And hasn't the defense itself tried to drag out some of the bigger names. When a bigger name has been mentioned, like, for example, Prince Andrew or former President Clinton or Marvin Minsky, these names that capture a lot of headlines, or Les Wexner, it's been drawn out by the defense. Do you think that's sort of a defense strategy to get the focus to someone other than their client?
Maybe. I don't see really how it benefits them, because when prosecution witnesses have testified about these big names, like the pilot talking about who was on the planes, for example, I think it serves to show how intimidating this all had to be. If you're a 14-year-old girl, and some of the victims have testified that I think Ghislaine and Jeffrey name dropped, and they felt very intimidated. And my clients, I think a couple of them said that he name dropped Bill Clinton, and they thought, here's a guy who knows former presidents and celebrities, and he's so wealthy, and I'm, a 14-year-old girl, a 17-year-old girl. How could I possibly go up against someone like this? So I think that's how they come in, and I think that Jeffrey and Ghislaine very intentionally dropped those names for that very reason.
Mm. And the name of former President Trump came up a number of times through the story
Yes.
of Virginia Roberts, now known as Virginia Giuffre. Uh, now that we're about to pivot to the defense, what do you expect their strategy to be? As you noted, they're calling, or at least potentially calling, dozens of witnesses. Where do you see this potentially going?
Well, I haven't seen their witness list. Have you?
And no, I don't think it's public yet.
Okay, so that's a mystery to me, who these 35 people are. We know about Elizabeth Loftus. She's the memory expert. I don't know. I mean, perhaps I would assume it's going to be people who are going to try to distance Ghislaine from Jeffrey Epstein. I think that's probably the best defense strategy. Whatever he did, but don't blame her for it. She didn't really know. She lived her own life. She wasn't a part of it. I would assume we're going to hear witnesses to say something like that, but otherwise, it's a mystery to me right now.
And in terms of, well, we have some sort of insight from the opening statement, right? Memory,
Yeah.
money, manipulation. Do you think that, say, the compensation fund, do you think that they're going to try to bring stuff out about that?
I mean, maybe it's already come out. I mean, the prosecution wisely preempted the issue by having the victims say, yeah, I went through the victim compensation fund. I got, in one case, $5 million. I think another case, 3 million, 1 million. So that's already out. Perhaps there's other documents and information. And I can tell you, having gone through the victim compensation fund with my 8 clients, we have their complaint, we submit a brief with all the facts in the law, we submit supporting evidence. So perhaps they have something there that they're going to bring out to try to really knock down the testimony of the accusers.
And what are your impressions of the attorneys arguing the case, both on the prosecution side and the defense side?
So I think the prosecution, they're very by the book. They're very straightforward, as prosecutors have to be. Prosecutors and defense attorneys have very different roles. Prosecutors are supposed to seek justice. They have ethical obligations above and beyond what defense attorneys have to do. And so I think they're very careful, very straightforward. I loved the prosecution's opening. It was brief. As I've said, nobody ever says, gee, I wish the lawyer had spoken longer. So that's always a challenge. I train my team, keep it short, write a brief, write a letter, and then go to it and do significant editing and cutting, because we don't need to hear you droning on and on, whether it's in writing or in person. So I thought that was great. I thought the defense was a little bit long-winded and said some crazy things like Jeffrey Epstein is the 21st century James Bond. What? I mean, other than them both being misogynists, I don't see that. So the defense is that they're very good attorneys. There's no doubt about it. Their job is to pick apart the story, show inconsistencies, sow doubt. And that's what they've tried to do, I think, with every witness.
And that's the kind of backbone of our system, that even the most despised clients get a very zealous defense, correct?
Absolutely.
And So in terms of the um, the road ahead, this will go to a defense case, this will go to closing arguments, we'll get a verdict. What are your clients looking for?
Well, they're looking for a conviction. I mean, clearly, I think they will be very distressed if there is not a conviction. Now, will it be a conviction on all charges? That's probably not significant to them, but they want to see accountability and justice. And to them, that means finding her guilty. Anything less, I think, will be very distressing to them.
And what would a conviction mean to them? Have you spoken about it? Have you prepared them for a verdict that
Yes.
could go either way?
Yes. Um, I have, and a lot of this is out of their control. They're not victims in this case, right? They had their own cases where they did have control. That's the nice thing about doing civil cases. What I do is that the client actually has a lot more control. She can make the decision whether to file, whether to settle, et cetera. In a criminal case, the state, the prosecutors, they make that decision. So they know that that could happen. She could be acquitted. I think it's highly unlikely. And all I can tell you is I think it would be very distressing to them.
Mm. Well, thank you, Lisa, for coming on the show. I really appreciate all of your insights, and I'll let you know when the podcast is out.
Well, thank you, Adam. And you're my number one follow for this trial on Twitter. So thank you for all of the updates and all of the articles. I really appreciate them.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.